Hello everyone, welcome to this lecture on symbolic meaning of culture. This lecture is part of your paper, Media, Culture and Society. In this lecture, we will learn that the symbols around us are deeply rooted in our cultural practices. They cannot be separated from everyday contexts. After reading this module, you'll be able to look at the civilizational and the descriptive meanings of culture retrospectively and critically. As the word symbolic suggests, this conception explains the cultural resources of human life and society. Symbols are a distinctive feature of human life. Today, the circulation of symbols have become a central aspect of our experiences in organizing our thought and ideas. Ernest Cassirer, in his book Philosophy of Symbolic Forms, holds that symbolic representation is an essential function of human consciousness, and it is fundamental to our understanding of human culture, including history, art, science, myth, and religion. Therefore, culture is embedded, and it refers to behavioral patterns socially acquired and socially transmitted by means of symbols. It includes language, tradition, customs, and institutions. For instance, there are prohibitions and prescriptions for the color of clothes to be worn during specific occasions, such as marriage ceremony or condolence. Symbolism is attached to colors in different religions and castes. Language is seen as one of the most significant symbolic expressions by virtue of which human beings communicate. Symbolic character of human life has been a constant theme of study for various scholars. Leslie Alvin White, in his book The Science of Culture, outlined the elements of symbolic conceptions of culture. He writes, and I quote, "Culture is the name of a distinct order or class or phenomenon, namely those things and events that are dependent upon the exercise of a mental ability particular to the human species that we have termed symbolic." Unquote. White's definition helps to prepare the way for a conception that emphasized the symbolic character of human life. But it was not until Clifford Gritz that symbolic conception gained currency. His magisterial work, The Interpretation of Cultures, places the symbolic conception at the center of academic debate. Moving away from a functionalist understanding, he carried out an interpretative analysis of culture. So he questioned the science of culture developed by positivist tradition discussed some time back. He conducted ethnographic studies in Indonesia and Morocco. He studied the cultural systems of these societies. For him, religion, which is part of culture, is a system of symbols. Therefore, culture is symbolic. Following the legacy of Max Weber, Gritz writes in his essay, Thick Description Towards an Interpretive Theory of Culture. Believing with Max Weber that man is an animal suspended in webs of significance he himself has spun, I take culture to be those webs and the analysis of it to be therefore not an experimental science in search of law, but an interpretive one in search of meaning. Unquote. He argues for a definition of culture which doesn't have multiple referents. He thinks that the way culture has been theorized as an umbrella concept, that is, everything that human beings have made and thought is culture, its analytical power is weakened. The emphasis on interpreting the meaning is the reason that his approach is called interpretive. The often quoted definition of culture that he has offered reads as follows, I quote, "Culture denotes an historically transmitted pattern of meanings embodied in symbols, a system of inherited conceptions expressed in symbolic forms by means of which men communicate, perpetuate, and develop their knowledge about and attitude towards life." Unquote. In analyzing culture, the task of a social scientist is not to discover laws, experimental scientists do, but to engage in unraveling layers of meaning, describing and redescribing actions and expressions which are already meaningful for the individuals who are producing, perceiving, and interpreting these actions and expressions in their everyday lives. This way, Geertz has oriented the analysis of culture towards the studying of meaning and symbolism and highlighted the centrality of interpretation as a methodological approach. In his account, the study of culture is not a classification of flora and fauna, but an activity more akin to interpreting a text. Along with Geertz, many others like Mary Douglas, Victor Turner, associated with the symbolic conceptualization of culture in the United States. But we are discussing Geertz's conception of details because the structural conception of culture developed by John Thompson is inspired in the first instance by Geertz's theorization. By giving importance to the meanings that are employed and understood by people, Geertz moved away from ethnocentric or Eurocentric perspective of looking at non-Western societies. But he fails to take into account the problems of power and social conflict. Thompson argues that cultural phenomena are viewed as meaningful construct, as symbolic forms, and the analysis of culture is understood as the interpretation of the patterns of meaning embodied in these forms. But cultural phenomena are also embodied in relations of power and conflict. Geertz's emphasis is on meaning rather than power. Thompson would like to take up this particular aspect in his structuralist conception of culture. Now, after this review of symbolic conception of culture in America, let's now discuss the development of these conceptions in India in the next presentation that follows. Look at the American social science had a great impact on initiating a branch of study of symbolic culture in India. Chicago University was instrumental in it. We cannot say that these studies were directly in the framework of Geertz, but the emphasis of transactionalism, symbols, rituals, and religion was inspired by American scholar Mackie Marriott. He presented a transactional view of caste, by which he meant that caste hierarchy is a result of transactions. But before Mackie Marriott, another American scholar, William Weiser, wrote on Hindu Jajmani system. The Jajmani system, as he defined, is a system that regulates the production and exchange of goods and services. One can incorporate the study of Jajmani system in the transactional view, as it highlights the transaction of goods and services. During, for instance, 1980s, there was a sizable increase in quantity and quality of publications on religious topics, again stimulated by the Chicago School. Appadurai's book, Worship and Conflict Under Colonial Rule, The South Indian Case. This presents a cultural view of colonialism. Appadurai was inspired by Geertz's definition of culture. His monograph is a study of a temple, Sri Parthasarathi Swami Vishnu Temple in Madras, now known as Chennai, from about mid-18th century to 1956. Appadurai looks at the history of various conflicts around the issue of control of the management of the temple. For him, such symbol signifies the power not over funds, but more on the manner of dispensation of religious honors. For him, the temple here is a symbol of key South Indian ideas of authority, exchanging, and worship. Along with the temples as the core of such studies, local mythical stories were also taken up to articulate a symbolic conception of culture in India. For instance, E. Valentine Daniel's book, Fluid Science, Being a Person the Tamil Way, in 1984, narrates the nature of personhood in Tamil culture through mythical story narrated to him by the villagers of a Hindu village near Tiruchirappalli. Such studies of symbolic culture actually addressed the analysis of caste system, but forward by a French scholar, Louis Dumont. Without going into the details of his work, let's refer his core idea on caste system in India. He said that the caste system has two core characteristics, one purity, the other pollution. Dumont has been criticized for his arguments. The studies of symbolic culture promoted by Chicago School were also criticizing his arguments, but with a different tone, which was as problematic as Dumont's argument is. For instance, Daniel in his book argues that India has been studied through the caste system. Scholars have subscribed to this idea that to understand India is to understand caste. Well, according to Daniel, this has prevented scholars to take into account the symbolic constructs which are more pervasive and regnant than caste. This argument is really problematic. For instance, Daniel in his book argues that India has been studied through the caste system. Scholars have subscribed to this idea that to understand India is to understand caste. According to Daniel, this has prevented scholars to take into account the symbolic constructs which are more pervasive and regnant than caste. This argument is really problematic. Another author who confronts Dumont's argument is Nicholas Dirks. Dirks writes in his book, Hollow Crown, Ethnohistory of an Indian Kingdom, on the vital significance of Hindu concepts of authority and kinship, which are particularly manifested in temple context. Confronting Louis Dumont's contentions about the primacy of caste, of the religious over political in Indian life, Dirks argues that kings were not inferior to Brahmins. He argues that politics plays a powerful role in the social organization of caste and kinship. Dirk contends that Dumont has embraced the colonial rationale that India had only religion and no state, no politics until the British came. For Dirks, this is an incorrect picture of India propagated by colonials to build up the rationale for this rule and supremacy. Therefore, Dirks' thesis in his book is that king and temple in India are inextricably connected, each sustaining the other in many different ways. Gloria Goodwin Reheja, who was also a student of Mackie Marriott, used transactional approach to kinship. So this monograph, The Poison in the Gift, Ritual, Prestation and the Dominant Caste in a North Indian Village, is a study of the semiotic aspect of giving and receiving, Lendan as it is called, in the Hindi-speaking region of North India. It is based on 18 months of field work carried out mostly in the village of Pahansu district of Uttar Pradesh from September 1977 to March 1979. She studied the rituals of pregnancy, birth, childhood, marriage, death, and then to determine dominance of Indian villages. She says that Dan is crucial to the life of village. She demonstrates the centrality of dominant Gujar landlords of Pahansu in the local configurations of castes and their role as jajmans, sacrificers. Her conclusion is that auspiciousness and inauspiciousness, rather than purity and pollution, are as exposed by Dumont, lie at the ideological core of the intercaste relations in village India. Therefore, in sum, she argues that the village India, there is no obligation for the dominant, in her case, the dominant Gujar landlords, to give inauspicious gifts for the subordinate to receive them, but for no one to repay. There were studies on symbolic aspects of marriage and kinship, such as Melinda Moore's Symbol and Meaning in Nair Marriage Ritual, which studies 3 rituals: Taliket, Tukalanyam, Tali tying ceremony, Tirandu Kalanyam, first menstruation rites, and Sambandhanam, the ceremony that begins a sexual relationship. Nair family and marriage system has been a source of curiosity for many scholars in India for many reasons. First, it's a marriage system where the bride doesn't move to the bridegroom's house after marriage. And secondly, the Sambandham relationships do not fit into the mainstream understanding of marriage in India. You have read that the symbolic conception of culture as it developed in America through Geer's theorization was entirely different from the earlier classical and descriptive conception of culture. At the same time, you have seen that the development of symbolic conception of culture in India did not follow Geer's theorization. Still, there is an Indian way of looking at symbolic aspects of culture. Kinship, caste, food practices, temples, and mythology were some of the prominent themes in India that were taken up for analysis in this presentation. For more details, please read the modules carefully and attempt the questions given at the end of each module. Thank you very much indeed.